In August 1914, a well-dressed man walks into a London bank. He places a crisp £5 note on the counter, a note that reads, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5. He asks for gold, as has been his right for a century. The teller, however, politely refuses. The bank's windows, usually open, are now barred. A small, almost invisible notice is posted on the door, citing a temporary government measure. He leaves, confused, holding a piece of paper that, for the first time, is just a promise, not a claim. In that moment, money stopped being something you could touch and became something you had to believe in. At the time, no one realized this temporary decision would never be fully reversed and would quietly shape every financial crisis that followed. It was a small administrative choice, a footnote in the opening act of a global conflict. But it was the moment the old world of money died and the modern world of finance was born.
This is the story of how the First World War didn't just redraw maps and topple empires, it fundamentally changed the DNA of money itself. To understand the scale of this change, we must first remember the world that was lost. Before 1914, money was a physical thing. It was gold. Paper notes were merely convenient certificates, receipts for a specific weight of gold held in a vault. This was the classical gold standard. It was a system built on a simple, powerful idea: trust but verify. You could, at any time, walk into a bank and exchange your paper for real physical metal. This link anchored the entire financial system. It imposed discipline. A government could not simply print more money than it had gold to back it. Inflation was a rarity. The value of money was stable, predictable, and international. A British pound, a French franc, or a German mark were all just different names for a specific quantity of gold.
It was a world of financial certainty, one that had powered a century of global trade and industrial expansion. But that certainty was about to be consumed by the fires of war. The real problem was not ideology or politics. It was arithmetic. The First World War was a conflict on an industrial scale never before seen. It cost millions of lives, but it also cost billions of dollars. The price of a single day of fighting could bankrupt a nation. By 1915, the daily cost of the war had reached £1 million. That was more than the entire annual budget of most nations just a decade before. The cost of artillery shells alone could exceed the GDP of smaller countries. A single tank cost more than a year's wages for 1,000 workers. A battleship cost more than a small nation's annual revenue. Governments quickly realized that taxes were not enough.
They could not raise taxes high enough, fast enough, to pay for the endless artillery shells, the rifles, the ships, the food for millions of soldiers. They needed more money than had ever existed, and the gold standard was in the way. It was a financial straitjacket. So one by one, the warring nations made a fateful decision. They suspended the gold standard. They cut the link between paper money and gold. What seemed like a temporary emergency measure was in fact a point of no return. But the real cost of this decision wouldn't be felt for another decade. With the anchor of gold removed, governments were free to pay for the war not with taxes, but with debt and the printing press. Central banks, once semi-independent institutions, became arms of the state. Their primary function now to finance the war effort. They printed money to buy government bonds, creating a cycle of debt that funded the trenches. This was a profound shift. Money was no longer a store of value.
It was now an instrument of state power. The war effort was not paid for by the wealth the nation had, but by the wealth it could promise to create in the future. This decision, made in the quiet offices of finance ministers, would have consequences that would echo for decades. And this was only the first time governments learned they could do this. The impact was immediate, though invisible to most. In Britain, the money supply nearly doubled between 1914 and 1918. In France, it tripled. In Germany, the printing presses ran so fast that by 1918 the currency was worth a fraction of its pre-war value. But the real cost was paid by ordinary people. A worker in Berlin watched his savings evaporate as prices climbed. A widow in Paris, living on a fixed pension, saw her income become worthless month by month. A shopkeeper in London watched prices climb faster than he could change the signs in his window. A teacher in Vienna, who had saved carefully for retirement, found that her nest egg could no longer buy a week's groceries. A farmer in the Rhineland, who had saved gold coins for his children's future, watched the government confiscate them in the name of the war effort. A nurse in Brussels, who had worked for 20 years, saw her life savings become pocket change. A clerk in Amsterdam, who had never spent a day in the military, watched his pension shrink to nothing. A mother in Antwerp, who had saved for her daughter's dowry, found the money worthless. Inflation was not an abstract economic concept. It was the silent theft of the future from those who had planned for it. It was the destruction of trust in the very system that had promised stability. It was the transfer of wealth from the savers to the spenders, from the careful to the reckless, from the future to the present. And it was deliberate. As the war dragged on, the development of this new financial system accelerated.
The first and most visible consequence was inflation. As governments printed money to pay their bills, the value of that money fell. Prices for everyday goods skyrocketed. Bread, coal, milk, the basics of survival, became luxuries for many. In some cities, food riots broke out. In others, people simply stopped working because their wages were worthless by the time they received them. The old certainties of the pre-war world were shattered. A man who had worked his entire life and saved diligently found himself poor. A widow with a fixed income found herself unable to afford heat in winter. A pensioner who had planned carefully for retirement found his income could no longer sustain him. A young couple who had saved for a house found their down payment worthless. A student who had saved for university found his education now unaffordable. This wasn't a bug in the new system, it was a feature.
Inflation was a hidden tax, a way to transfer wealth from the state to pay for the war. Those who had saved money were punished. Those who had borrowed money were rewarded. The incentives of the entire economy had been inverted. The role of the state itself was changing. Before the war, governments were small. Their economic role was limited. Now, they were the largest single actor in the economy, controlling industries, setting prices, and managing a war machine financed by a limitless supply of newly created money. The temporary measures were becoming permanent. The financial architecture of the 19th century was being dismantled, piece by piece, and replaced with something entirely new. A system where money was not backed by gold, but by the government's promise to pay its debts. A system where central banks held immense power. A system where inflation was not an accident, but a tool. A system where the future could be mortgaged to pay for the present.
A system where trust in money depended not on physical backing, but on faith in government. When the war ended in November 1918, there was hope. Surely, people thought, things would return to normal. The printing presses would stop. The gold standard would be restored. The old certainties would return. But they never did. Governments faced a terrible choice. Returning to gold wasn't just unpopular,
It was mathematically impossible without destroying the post-war economy. The amount of paper money and debt created during the war was so vast that it was impossible to go back. Britain tried anyway. In 1925, the British government, led by Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill, made the decision to return to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. It was a disaster. The pound was overvalued. British exports became uncompetitive. Unemployment soared. The decision would haunt the British economy for the next decade. France faced similar pressures. The franc collapsed and had to be devalued. Germany, burdened with war reparations and a collapsing currency, spiraled into hyperinflation. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. A worker's weekly wages couldn't buy a single meal. The savings of an entire generation were wiped out in weeks. People burned money for heat because it was cheaper than coal. The new normal was a world of floating currencies, powerful central banks, and permanent government debt. The financial system we live in today, where money is an abstract concept created by central banks and managed by governments, was not the result of a grand plan. It was forged in the emergency of the First World War. The war had not just been won with soldiers and steel, but with debt and inflation, and that had changed the very definition of money forever. What this teaches us is that wars are not just fought on battlefields, they are fought on ledgers.
They don't just destroy cities and lives, they redefine the very systems we use to organize our world. The First World War revealed a powerful and dangerous truth, that in times of crisis, the rules that govern money are not fixed. They are tools of power to be bent, broken, and remade to serve the needs of the state. The sober, predictable world of the gold standard was replaced by the flexible but far more fragile world of fiat money. Money is not a product of nature, but of history, a history written in the ink of government decrees and the blood of forgotten conflicts. Every debate about inflation, debt, and central banks today traces back to this moment. When you hear economists argue about whether central banks should raise or lower interest rates, they are arguing about the legacy of 1914. When you see governments printing money to fight a crisis, they are following a playbook written in the trenches. When you watch the value of your savings erode year after year, you are experiencing the long shadow of a decision made more than a century ago. The institutions that govern our money today, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, are all children of the First World War. They exist because governments learned that they could finance wars and crises and ambitions by controlling the printing press. That power has never been relinquished. It has only grown stronger, and the consequences of that power are still unfolding. This is why understanding 1914 is not about the past. It is about understanding the present. It is about seeing the invisible architecture that shapes our lives. It is about recognizing that the money in your pocket is not a thing, but a story, and stories can change. This channel documents moments when the rules of money change forever. If you want to understand the forces that shape our financial world, subscribe. We are building a community of people who want to see how the system works from the inside. Next, we will explore the crash that reset the world, 1929, and the collapse of a system built not on gold, but on a fragile new kind of trust called confidence.